So, hey, everybody, thanks for joining this talk today. If you've been working in CTI for some time now, you've probably attended a presentation or presentations in the past that were focused on helping organizations develop a CTI function. This is actually not going to be that type of talk. Today, we're kind of talking about the next step in the iterative process of maturing a CTI team. So we're really focused today on talking about how do you develop and sustain a successful brand for your CTI team, and why doing so is such an essential component towards supporting the long-term success of any CTI capability or service. I think the slides might be stuck for me. Go. So unfortunately, Ryan cannot make today. Ryan is the head of CTI here at Target. He's been here for almost a decade now, and he was not only instrumental in developing the content for this presentation, but he has also been an instrumental part of my growth as an analyst and as a leader here at Target during my 5+ years here. Again, he currently leads all of CTI, including several other support functions. I've been at Target for just over 5 years now, with about 13 total in cybersecurity. I currently oversee our data collection, tactical analysis, and reverse engineering capabilities. All right, so moving on to this slide, really the groundwork that Ryan and I wanted to set when we came up with this presentation was talking about what a brand is versus what it's not. So on the left-hand side of your screen there, you'll see, a lot of logos related to some really prominent brands within the United States. One of the things that we wanted to call out here is that, a logo is certainly part of a brand, but it is not the core essence of one. So when you're trying to develop a brand for your CTI team, what does that look like? Like, what is that actual brand? And we came up with a few sentiments here, and this will probably carry over through the rest of the presentation here. It's really an experience you create. It's the reputation you cultivate both internally and externally. It's how you communicate. It's an emotional connection with your audience. It's what sets you apart from others. And when you deliver on these ideals, you create value and establish trust, which is really the cornerstone of any brand. So trust is really what we mean when we say building a brand for CTI. And we're going to continue to talk about trust throughout this presentation. And just on a personal note for me, the brand of Target CTI team is what made me want to seek a position here on the team, again, almost 5.5 years ago when I was looking for a new career opportunity. So having a very strong brand that people respect and trust is not just going to help you develop relationships in the organization you work within, so internal stakeholders, or externally with folks that are working as part of peer organizations within ISACs, but it could also be used from a talent development standpoint as well. So recruiting people outside of the organization or getting talent to want to come from other teams that's already within your organization. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, so again, as part of developing this presentation, Ryan and I want to define what we're calling pillars. There are 5 of them total that we believe are really essential for a CTI team to develop to ultimately bolster a strong brand presence. What you can kind of break these up into is the first 2 are inward focused, whereas the latter 3 are more outward focused. So let's start with the first 2 that are inward focused. First one is defining the brand. So this is really your brand identity. It's your mission scope in terms of who and what you are as a team, capability, service, etc. And then moving on to pillar 2, these are the core elements. These 4 elements are really the nucleus of what we're going to talk about today, in addition to these 5 pillars. They're necessary for not only building trust, but also for sustained success and evolution of your CTI program. Moving on to the next 3 pillars, which are really more outward focused, starting with relationships. This is really your brand reputation. So it's how you identify and establish partnerships with internal and external stakeholders. And the success is dependent on clear and concise collaboration, a theme that I'm going to come back to several more times throughout this presentation. Pillar four is really all about creating value. So this is your brand expertise per se. It's how you ensure the stakeholders you're serving see the relevance of CTI to their individual and collective team objectives. And then finally, wrapping up the pillars is going to be delivering on expectations. So this is how you build your credibility and establish trusted relationships. And it's dependent on several factors that we've defined today, including feedback loops, metrics, and continuous process improvements.
Hey, Matt, you can click into the screen and then use the arrows on the bottom left to advance your slides.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see those on my setup.
Do you see these arrows right here? On the bottom left here?
I do not.
Okay. I will go ahead and advance your slides.
Okay, thank you. All right, so moving on to defining the brand. So there's really two core aspects here. It's the why and the what. The mission being the why and the deliverables being the what. So your CTI brand is not just about the team's technical capabilities, but also how they are perceived by your stakeholders, whether they be internal or external. So starting off with the mission, a defined mission is really crucial for CTI because it provides a clear focus for the cyclical intelligence process. It explains why you have a team. It provides direction and purpose to help solve business problems and align efforts accordingly. We've probably all been in this position at one point in our career. If you've been working with CTI for quite some time now, you know, you're asked to stand up a CTI team and maybe there's not a clear reason behind it. So if you don't have a clear reason behind it, that's really where, again, throughout the rest of this presentation, we hopefully can give you some ideas for really aligning what your goals are as a CTI team to what the business objectives are and trying to help solve problems from a risk mitigation standpoint. So really think about, again, the mission as, you know, the why you exist. In terms of deliverables, this really comes down to what intelligence requirements you're aligned to in terms of your production. You know, are these things actionable? Are they intentional? Can you quickly tailor them for different stakeholders? Are they consistent in terms of the delivery, quality, etc.? Is there some sort of visual identity for different deliverables? And that's something we'll get into when we go further into the creating value slide. One of the pain points here is producing intelligence for the sake of production. So really just intel as a checkbox. There's no defined criteria or business relevance. So really here you want to focus on analyzing a blend of both internal telemetry and external observations relevant to your business operations. So taking a deeper dive into those four core elements, which again, you can think of these as really being the nucleus to what you're building in terms of your brand for your CTI team. So starting at the top here with reliability, this is really all about providing accurate, actionable, and quality intelligence. Consistency really applies more towards finished output in terms of deliverables, but also it applies to the processes you put in place that enable that intelligence production. So one of the key points we wanted to call out here is making sure that you develop and continuously update clear and concise standing operating procedures. And that's been something we put a big focus on here at Target towards the end of 2024. So even for a team that's been around for, you know, about a decade or so now, you know, we're still trying to make sure as we bring on new analysts that they have those SOPs to fall back on as sort of their source of truth. From a scalability aspect, we're really focusing on, you know, handling increased workloads as demand for our services increase. And one of the key points we want to call out here is, you know, everybody talks about automation, but how can you find ways to automate some of the mundane tasks in order to increase operational efficiencies for your team? So really just finding some of the lower hanging fruit to tackle. We'll show some examples in the next few slides, kind of talking about how some of our Intel products and the processes behind them have really evolved from a manual to more of an automated fashion. And then finally, moving on to proactivity. So this really means, you know, you're left of bang of the threats. You're able to anticipate and prevent them rather than react to them. And one of the key points we want to call out here is making sure you have some sort of method to curate and continuously update a knowledge base of historical intelligence so that you're able to analyze trends that can hopefully inform future adversarial behavior. And I think there was actually a presentation given today by Mandy that talked about how to create threat profiles. So that might be a really great resource for individuals to go back to and reference when they're thinking about, how do I know what threats are relevant to my business? How do I profile them to figure out, where do I start from a control standpoint, whether it be, people, process, technology. So I think that'd be a really good reference for people to look back to when it comes to that slide. All right, moving on to relationships. I think this is probably the most important in terms of the 5 pillars that we're going to talk about. So if you really want to maximize that brand exposure, you need to establish relationships outside of your inner circle, per se, which is really that cyber defense circle at the bottom portion of that infographic below. The more you attempt to expose your brand across the organization, the more crucial it becomes for clear and concise communications. And really the word I want you to take away from this when it comes to building relationships is clarity. The clarity becomes incredibly important, especially when you're talking to non-technical audiences. In addition to that, you really want to make sure you have a mindset focused on what problems you are helping the business solve in terms of risk mitigation. And one of the things we also wanted to focus on when we were building the content for this presentation is, for a lot of organizations out there, you may not have a dedicated CTI team. And what I mean by that is the folks in your CTI team might be wearing many different hats. So, when you're attempting to create value in those layers that are outside of just your traditional cyber defense roles, you really want to make sure that you're thinking of the problems you're trying to solve in terms of, how the business wants to approach them. So thinking more with the business mindset and really making sure that you're, again, clear and concise in how you're approaching those stakeholders and trying to really make sure they understand the value you're trying to provide to them. And this will ultimately help you set, yourselves apart in terms of, getting visibility with upper management, hopefully them seeing the potential in your service, your capability in order to, get future investment, whether it comes to, additional headcount, technologies, et cetera, going forward. So really relationships all come down to clarity. So moving on to creating value, true success for us, how we've defined it, really lies within 3 steps, and we're going to showcase those 3 steps in the next few slides with some examples. First of which is identifying an audience. So who's the audience you're trying to help solve a problem for and deliver and create value for? So that really goes back to that last slide on that layered approach to relationships. You're then going to define a problem to solve. Again, keeping that within a business mindset, not getting too overly technical. And I think the last example we're going to provide here will hopefully resonate with everybody on this call. And then the final step is really establishing a consistent and repeatable process to cultivate and deliver relevant intelligence. And ultimately, you want to implement a feedback loop to be able to listen to those stakeholders, hear their needs, and then kind of put that back into the future state of your products to really achieve that sustained success and build as much trust as possible with those stakeholders. So, as I mentioned, we're going to go through several examples and kind of build on top of one another in terms of starting more in that inner layer and then building use cases outside of that. But again, 3 things I really want to emphasize is making sure that when you're doing this, you're identifying the audience, you're making sure, there's a specific problem or sets of problems you're trying to solve. You're creating a repeatable product with a built-in feedback loop. And then ultimately that product is maturing in terms of how it's delivered on the back end. So kind of moving away from manual operations into more automated fashion so that you can really achieve, some greater operational efficiencies. All right, so this first use case is really more tied to that traditional, cyber defense relationship layer. So in this case, we're passing over intelligence to a variety of teams within our Cyber Fusion Center, including our incident response team, our detection operations team, et cetera. What we're doing here is really giving them a heads up that, we're tracking some threat infrastructure that has just gone live. We believe it's tied to a cybercrime group commonly known as Fin6. And we want to make sure that we implement the necessary controls in terms of scoping our network for any traffic and, ultimately blocking that indicator to make sure nobody's able to browse to that site. But again, wanted to dive a little bit deeper into this model here on the left-hand side of your screen, because it's going to be the common theme over the next couple of slides. So again, everything starts off with an analyst identifying something, whether it's some sort of automated collection capability they already had in place, which in this case it was, or noticing something in some sort of commercial threat feed, or maybe through a technology like Feedly, which we use extensively here in our CTI team. And taking that information and storing it inside of some type of knowledge base. So in this case, we developed a couple of years ago a homegrown threat intelligence platform called WaveSurfer. If you attended the CTI summit here back in 2021, you might have come across the Wave framework before. So this really spawned out of that. And that was developed by my colleague, Kelsey Helms, and another former Target colleague as well. But, this could be a commercial tip. We use this in conjunction with threat quotient. It could be something like NIST that we used to use. It could be Confluence, for example. But just having some sort of tech stack in place to, document this intelligence and then ultimately build some processes off of that. We use Slack a lot for internal communications. So really, we, developed a mechanism over time to pipe the form that we fill out inside of that tip over to Slack in a channel that all of our Fusion Center, is able to communicate real time with. So figuring out, did we, have any users that browse to that site? Is there anything else that needs to be done from a prevention or a mitigation standpoint? And then ultimately, again, that feedback loop really helps us understand, what kinds of actions are being taken real time. So it's not just, throwing something over the fence and not having any real time collaboration with those stakeholders. We're really trying to make sure that, it's a constant push and pull of intelligence with those teams. And hopefully you'll see that over the next two examples as well that we're going to go into. All right, so this one, think outside of just that cyber defense layer. This example applies to that layer as well, but it also applies to the InfoSec and the technology layers. So in this case, we identified some vulnerability exploitation activity. We plugged that information into our tip. Once the analysts filled in the appropriate fields, that information would ultimately trigger a Slack alert to our vulnerability management team, who would not only work with our cyber defense team to figure out, from an attribution standpoint, who is the threat actor behind the exploitation activity, but also work with folks across technology that own the infrastructure that's going to need to be updated, and try to figure out, if there is exploitation in the wild, if there is a proof of concept exploit code, that's going to allow them to really provide some business justification for expediting that patching process. So that's really what they look to us for from an intel standpoint, is trying to help them, remediate the issues as quickly as possible. So that's a relationship that I think is critical to any cyber defense organization. Again, it kind of goes outside of that initial layer into a few, the next two layers that we're talking about here. So you're really just taking one process that you created that we showed in the slide before, and building off that, and really trying to, again, once you identify the audience, once you identify the problem, you're then creating a repeatable process that your analysts can follow, and ultimately building off of that in terms of, making it as less manual as possible in future iterations. Because a lot of this for us used to be, manual typing into Slack or manually sending emails. But now we have, a living reference point inside of that threat intelligence platform. That data is not going anywhere. And then we have the real-time feedback loop inside of Slack to track, what actions are really happening real time. So it's been a really good recipe for success for us over, the last few years. If we go to the last slide, so this is really getting into that business partners layer. So, this is probably going to be the most difficult for most CTI teams. It certainly is not, without its struggles on our side. We need to make sure we're constantly keeping the business's needs in mind. And, in this case, we're talking about the threat of North Korea IT workers. So, this really comes down to, in my opinion, emphasizing the importance of creating value and building trust through clear and concise engagement, using that business lens rather than solely focusing on security. So you could go to the business partners in this case. It could be human resources, it could be talent acquisition, and tell them, North Korea's up to no good again. They're using ransomware. They're conducting software supply chain compromise attacks. That's probably not going to resonate very well with them. But what will is, you say, if we hire these individuals, we're going to have to fire them immediately because they're not legitimate. So that's going to waste time, money, resources on your side of the house that could otherwise be spent, on employees that we want to actually hire, retain, and invest, our time, money, and resources into. So really putting it in that lens, it may sound self-explanatory, but I'm telling you, as somebody that's worked at a number of different organizations at this point, this is really, I think, the hardest mindset for a CTI analyst to kind of come around to. And once you do that, things really start clicking and things become a lot more simple for you in terms of understanding how to create value and build trust with those internal stakeholders. All right, so moving on to our last pillar here, delivering on expectations. This really is, kind of a, three crux here. We'll start with the feedback loops. So these really act as a mechanism to understand your stakeholder needs and adapt intelligence production based on listening to the continuous improvement that you're getting back in terms of feedback. And then moving on to metrics and reporting, these really help establish trust through transparency. We'll go into metrics a little bit more in the next slide, but these measurements should not only reflect CTI's activities itself, but more importantly, the impact it has on reducing risk across an organization. And one of the recent examples that comes to mind for me was the CyberHaven Chrome extension supply chain compromise attack, and that getting ultimately flushed out into 36 more extensions. That helped us reduce a lot of risk across our organization in terms of identifying what users are using those extensions. How do we go about not only remediating that occurrence itself, but how do we bake in better controls going forward to mitigate any sort of installation of those compromised extensions in the future. And then finally, continuous process improvements. So these can really strengthen trust through transparency as well. It really shows your team's commitment to continuous improvement and maturation. And one of the key tips I would give you that I think Ryan and all of the CTI team throughout its existence here at Target has done well is really make sure you're marketing your CTI team successes both internally and externally. So if you saw on a few slides prior, we've done a really good job, I think, over time of evolving what our products look like from a branding standpoint. Just having flashy branding on your products is not going to make them valuable to your stakeholders. Again, you're really going to want to make sure that the intelligence inside of those products is what's driving the value. But over time, you want to, have a better eye for, trying to market yourselves with things like, flashy branding, logos, things like that. So you'll certainly get to a point in your team's maturation for wanting to get there, but also externally as well. So promoting things on LinkedIn, making sure that, you're getting out there at conferences and speaking about what your team is doing. At the end of the day, one of the keys to success for a CTI team is being able to, pick up the phone or type a Slack message to colleagues across different sectors and try to share information. I mean, that's really, something for me from a networking standpoint that I've learned that's extremely valuable. So really just making sure that you're marketing your team's successes both internally and externally. I think that's key from a continuous process improvement standpoint. All right, in terms of metrics, somebody mentioned this to me the other day. I think it really encapsulates this slide really well. For us, metrics are really a gut check to see if we're focusing on the right things. So again, as part of developing that mission for your brand, you're establishing direction and purpose, and that's going to feed directly back into the metrics you're collecting. We typically focus on a few key items. So collection in terms of trends, what intelligence are we collecting, the amount that leads to net new detection. So how much of that intel is actually actionable for some of our partner fusion center teams. And one of the pain points that I would call out here is, having metrics just for the sake of, them to exist. So there's no identity, there's no purpose to that. You could just be collecting metrics in terms of, tracking volume, which typically is not going to lead to any sort of risk reduction, which I think a lot of our metrics have evolved into over time.
Sounds like
Potentially using them
oh, you're
for
back. Okay.
potentially
We just lost you a bit. You might reset. Just go back about 15, 20 seconds or so.
okay. All right. So I think we were talking about some of the things we find valuable for metrics. So this really comes down to, for us, focusing on collection trends. So what intel are we collecting? What threats are we focused on? Those should tie right back to your priorities. The amount of leads that intelligence leads to in terms of net new detection. So how actionable is that for your partner teams? And really, again, one of the pain points that I mentioned before I cut out, I think, was collecting metrics for the sake of tracking volume or using them for micromanagement purposes. That's not going to be something that's going to be sustainable or successful for your CTI team in the long run. I know we're running a little bit short on time here, so I just want to wrap up this slide by saying, a lot of SANS contributors, including John Doyle, who's a mentor to me throughout this process, they published a really great blog back on January 9th talking about, developing metrics for your CTI team. So I'm happy to provide a link to that inside of the Slack chat, but I think that's a really great resource. Again, that's tied to the great work that SANS does that folks can reference, when they're thinking about, am I collecting the right metrics? If you're starting a program, what metrics would be good for me to start with? So I think that's a really good resource for people to reference going back to. All right, so to wrap this up, hopefully we have time for Q&A still. Really, I just want to emphasize here, the 5 pillars as the foundation of building your brand. And then, kind of intertwined with those 5 pillars are going to be the 4 core elements that really act as the nucleus for your brand. And then all of it ties back to really the cornerstone of your brand, which is trust. Without trust, you have nothing. Again, I think about trying to come to this team, 5.5 years ago, there were 2 companies I was looking at. There was only one that had an opening at the time, and I knew I could trust Target CTI team to really make me a better analyst, make me a better leader. And, I'm happy to say that's certainly paid off. But, if you really focus on those 5 pillars, you focus on those 4 core elements, and everything kind of ties back to trust, you're going to be on your ways to really building a successful and a sustainable brand for your CTI team. And again, none of these concepts are truly groundbreaking per se, but if you implement them correctly, they can really, help you hit your stride and achieve your long-term objectives as a CTI team. So with that, thank you very much for attending this presentation. Happy to answer any questions afterwards. We've got our LinkedIn profiles listed there on the slide, and I also listed a link to Target's cybersecurity tech blog as well, where we try to share a lot of the interesting things that we're developing internally here. So again, thanks, Rick, and thanks to everybody at SANS for the opportunity today. Appreciate it.